Bom, muito obrigada. Nós estamos com o tempo um pouco corrido, então, para já, eu quero agradecer a todos e quero convidar já ao palco, por gentileza, Biling.
I'll wait for Louisa to get into the back room. We're going to do a voice-activated presentation here, so bear with me. But while she goes backstage to prepare this new technology, just a few words about me. So I'm the Global Head of Trends and Foresight at Ipsos Strategy 3. And me and my colleagues are here for the next 3 days to take you on a data-driven journey to navigate the poly crisis. And it was interesting hearing some of the opening speeches and the debates this morning, because it's something that obviously we're all accepting that we're living in right now. So hopefully I can give you some tips and tricks as to how to navigate this world. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in the words of Gramsci, we're at this moment in time where the old world is dying and the new is not yet born. So we're in this moment of challenge where we're seeing lots of different crises appear at the same time. And if we go to the next slide, and it's a world not of crisis, but of crises. We're seeing this from the geopolitical tensions that are happening around the world, the long-standing wars, the new conflicts that we're seeing in the most recent years. And of course, in all of this, we're still living in a world where the climate crisis is ever more pressing, particularly when we start feeling the effects of this at a local level to ourselves and our families. And of course, this is exacerbating more issues as well. So we're living in this world where there are many different issues that are interrelated and at play. So it's impossible for us just to tackle one challenge. We've got to think about the challenges in completion. So if we look at the next slide, Adam Tooze puts this quite succinctly. He talks about living in a polycrisis where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and this is the world that we live in. If we go to the next slide, though, there is hope for us, though. So against this backdrop of crises and this discord, there are things that unite us as people around the world, and there are common values, so we do have hope. So my colleague Marina is going to take you on a more of this tomorrow in terms of diving into the citizen and consumer level data. But to begin, if we go to the next slide, we see that actually both citizens think that brands and humans ourselves have a role in thinking about the future. And if we click next, we see that 8 in 10 of us think that it is possible for both brands to make money and support good causes at the same time. The next click, most of us are happy to pay more for brands that act responsibly. And the last click, we all are pretty much agreed that we all have to change our habits if we're going to tackle the environmental crisis. So as a global nation, these are things that are important to us. And if we go to the next slide, we do some work at Ipsos called the Global Happiness Survey, and we can see that despite this polycrisis and all these issues that are happening, nearly 3/4 of us around the world say they feel happy. So despite all of this, we're still able to put a smile on our faces. But if we take another click, I think it's interesting to see how our LATAM counterparts versus our European counterparts compare on this. So us Europeans are a little bit more miserable, so I'll let you discuss that over coffee and try and come up with the reasons. But if we go to the next slide, please, we are still living in this world of many, many challenges happening, and it's important for us to understand how to navigate that as brands, as businesses, as governments, and as organisations. So on the next slide, I just wanted to introduce our Ipsos Global Trends. This is a piece of work that we do annually at Ipsos, and it helps us look at the citizen-level values and attitudes that are happening around the world. We put this into the picture of the macro context, and we also look at what's happening on the ground in different markets to really understand how this change is happening over time. And if we go to the next slide, part of this toolkit is what we call our theory of change, and it helps us understand how these different aspects of change are interacting and driving change within each other. So at the far left of our diagram, we have our macro forces, the big issues that I've just discussed. These are the huge forces, if you like, that are playing out across the world. They tend to be quite global in nature, and they are going to impact us all, be it citizens, consumers, governments, organisations, brands and businesses. They're the overarching environment in which we live. On the other side of our diagram, we have what we call our signals of change. These are the fast-moving ideas that we see on the ground. So things that are happening in culture, for instance, at a local level, new innovations, new communications campaigns. And at the heart of this change ecosystem, we have our human-level attitudes and values. And by analysing all this, it can help us take a think about what the future might look like. It's important to say, though, that this model and this thinking can never help us predict the future. Actually, predicting the future is pretty much impossible. You know, none of us have a crystal ball, or if we do, it probably isn't going to predict the future. But this type of thinking can help us plan for different eventualities, have a think about how those contrasting macro issues can interact and cause opportunities and threats for our organisations, our societies. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to focus today's conversation on the macro level, and I'm going to take us through these 3 questions. So the first question I'm going to answer is, why should we think about the future? Why is that something important that we should care about? The second point is, why is it a critical urgency today, not just to focus on today's challenge, but also to think about planning for what's coming down the line? And the third question, which I hope will be a bit fun, I'm going to take you on a journey through how to be a foresight professional. So without further ado, if we move to the first section, please. So why should we think about the future? So on the next slide, actually wanting to think beyond today is something that we've been doing for over a millennia. So this is a site in Greece, and in the 8th century BCE, there was an oracle who lived here at Delphi, and she helped people think about what was to come. She was very clever in that she never told people predictions, but she talked about a number of different possible outcomes to help them think and guide what they were going to do next. So it's something that's been in our psyche, and it's something that we have an innate ability to do as humans. And actually, on the next slide, we have Daniel Gilbert, in his book Stumbling on Happiness, helped us understand that actually this is the one thing, thinking about the future, that sets us apart from animals. So it's an innate thing that we do as human beings. And on the final slide, it's something that we've been talking about and depicting in popular culture for many years. So science fiction books, cartoons, all sorts of things. And of course, in some of these books, these novels and this media, we do have a think about what the future might hold. Of course, not all of these things come to pass, but elements of them might come true. And finally, if we go to the next slide, if being human, not being an animal, having a liking for science fiction is not enough, being future ready is actually super important for us in terms of growing the economy. So when we looked at a journal of technological forecasting, we found that 33% of firms achieve higher profitability if they are more future ready, and they are able to deliver 200% higher growth. So this doesn't just have implications for us, but it actually has economical implications too. So that sets the scene in terms of why we should think about the future. If we go to the next section, we now can talk about why this is a critical urgency for today. So if we move to our first slide, these are the 6 macro forces that impact us as governments, societies, people, consumers. And we developed these as part of our Global Trends 2023 work that we published just earlier this year. And underneath each of these are about 36 different themes which ladder up to these overarching macro forces. Now, what's important to look at here is, if we go to the next slide, the fact that they don't live in isolation. We can't just tackle one of these issues. We need to think about the multitude of forces at play. And you might be wondering why I'm taking this higher level macro force picture at a conference about ESG, but that's because the decisions that we're making around ESG in terms of the outcomes, the plans, are going to be affected by all of these other things. So ESG lives in a world where we're having community migration, and that could be actually exacerbated by climate change. It lives in a world, and we discussed this earlier today, where we're seeing exponential growth in AI. It lives in a world where we're already seeing massive inequalities and opportunities around the world. And how can we use this to make sure that we're not doing more damage to those and actually pulling people out of poverty and giving them better lives? It lives in a world where we've got a massively growing mental health crisis. So I urge you all in this room, when you're thinking through your ESG plans, your ESG policies, to not think about them in isolation, but to consider them in this wider set of interrelated and interconnected forces. Now, to bring that to life a little bit more tangibly, if we move to the next slide, please, I wanted to take you through a series of just 3 projections. Now, as I mentioned before, these are not predictions. Nobody knows what's going to happen even tomorrow, let alone in 5, 10, 15 years' time. But we can look at particular demographic projections to paint a picture of how the world might look like in years to come. So this is a projection of experts who say that by 2050, the total world will be online. Now, why that's important today is that 2050 is a few years away, and right now, 1/3 of our world are not yet online. So as we move to more digital-first strategies, as things like e-commerce and m-commerce and Q-commerce are proliferating and expanding and growing, we have to remember that some sections of society are being disadvantaged because they can't yet access the internet. And this is really important because as tech accelerates, we're also going to see inequalities and opportunities also expand. And can we wait until 2050 for everyone to get online to correct this? No, I don't think we can. We should be thinking about this now. And if we move to the next slide, just last month, the UN said that we need to do more. We need to bring countries and all stakeholders together to really create this equitable digital future for all. It's something that we need to tackle now. If we move to the next projection, this is something that's come up again in the discussion already this morning. But by 2050, 2/3 of the global population are going to be living in urban areas. And to set the scene, today it's around about half of the world. Now, there are many macro forces that are both driving this and also as a cause of this. But the main ones that I wanted to look at today is that as urbanization starts to grow in more Western and developed markets, we're going to be seeing more ideas around smart cities, around eco-friendly building, and that's going to help people both in terms of providing housing and infrastructure, but also doing great things against the environmental emergencies and also harnessing tech. But in the more challenged parts of the world, where we're seeing urgent urbanization because communities are migrating due to conflict, due to climate change, and we're seeing governments having to rush to meet the needs, there's going to be massive pressures on infrastructure, on housing, on society, on healthcare, and that's going to further exacerbate inequalities. And again, if we move to the next slide, a quote that sort of sums this up again from the UN in a Malaysian paper last month. Planning urbanization has to be inclusive and resilient to future threats, because what it does if we don't do this is really exacerbates those issues of the most affected vulnerable communities. So if we move to the next slide, the final projection that I wanted to talk about today is the aging population. Now today, the median age globally is 30 years old, and by 2050 this will rise to 36. Now, a lot of the rhetoric in the West talks about aging populations, and of course we know for parts of LATAM, for the West and some parts of Asia, this is an issue that we're having to face into. We're facing the impacts of what that's going to do to social and healthcare, facing the impacts of how that's going to be in terms of things like workforce drain. But actually, this actually masks that many parts of the world, such as Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of Asia, actually have quite youthful populations. And these are going to be our new economic powerhouses of the future, because those youthful populations are going to be driving growth. So again, I urge you to have a think about these two sides of the coin. I think, and us for one, we talked a lot about ageing populations in our 2023 Global Trends Report, but we need to be mindful that there's an other side to this as well. And if we move to the next slide, again, a quote that sort of underlines this. So older persons are invaluable sources of knowledge and experience and have so much to share, particularly when tackling some of those issues that we've just talked about earlier on. So to round off this section on the last slide, I think what's important to show is that we need to balance the needs of today while also planning for the needs of tomorrow. So again, when you're thinking through your ESG strategies, when you're having conversations based on this conference over the next 3 days, do you have a think about these wider questions as well? How can we ensure that our digital strategies are not excluding a third of the world? How can we make sure that we're providing housing and infrastructure for people who really need it without exacerbating some of the challenges at play? And finally, how do we prepare for half the world that's aging while also not forgetting that half of the world are still youthful, and we need to harness that because that's where our youthful populations will be. So on the next slide, I have an idea, and I think this plays into a lot of the conversation that we had already this morning. So it's going to take systems thinking. It's going to take collaboration where competitors actually work together on a solution. And it's going to take collaborative foresight for people like you in this room today to have a think about what we want the future to look like and put plans in place to really push towards those futures. So that rounds off the second section of my presentation. If we move to the next slide, please. What I wanted to do now is just walk through some ideas which can help you all in this room today to become members of the Foresight Club. So the type of mindset that we all need to embrace to have a think about how we can tackle these future challenges. So if we move to the next slide, this is the 8 rules of Foresight Club for you here today in this room. And if we click next, the first rule is, and I've mentioned this already a few times today, but if you want to be in the Foresight Club, you can't talk about predicting the future. That's very hard to do / impossible. Like I say, we might have some crystal balls at home, but whether they actually allow us to tell what's going to happen next is a question mark. And actually, even experts struggle with this. So this is a chart that shows 10-year Treasury rates, and the coloured lines show the projections that experts provided, and the blue line shows the reality. So there you go. Those experts can't predict the future. And if we click next, I'm afraid that this just has to be reiterated one more time. You're not a member of the Foresight Club if you talk about predicting the future. So if we move to our second rule, it's really important, and this is particularly crucial to mention when we're living in this world of polycrisis. It can feel like we wake up every day to an ever-changing world, an ever-changing environment. But it's really important for us to understand both what does change, but also what doesn't. And here is a case in point. So this is a Telegram and a WhatsApp message. So here you can see that the technology has changed quite substantially over that near century, but actually the fundamental need for socialization and connection remains the same. So that's an example of what remains the same and what changes. If we move to our third rule, please, it's really important when we're thinking about futures work to talk about futures in the plural. As we move towards the future, as the future becomes further away from us, there are more eventualities that can come to play. There are more critical factors that could occur. There are more what we call wildcards, like the pandemic, which have a massive impact if they're going to happen, but a low likelihood of happening. And these are all things that can interact and actually present multiple possible futures. So when we're planning, please don't just plan for one perfect thing that we want to happen. Have a think about those more uncomfortable ideas that could come to pass too. The fourth rule, please. It's really easy when it comes to thinking about foresight to think about the world as it is today, but with lots of technological evolution. And of course, technology will be part of the future, that's a given, but it's not the only part. We need to understand how societal changes play a role, how economic development's going to play a role, how our plans to tackle ESG are going to play the role. So we need to think beyond just the technological advancements that we're seeing. If we move to our fifth rule, we need to be open-minded. So, can you imagine 10 years ago being able to walk down the street with something in your ear and being able to surf the web, get a weather forecast, write an email, take a phone call? It would have been quite hard to imagine. So when we do foresight work, we need to be open-minded to the art of the possible. If we move to the sixth rule, this is important. It's very hard, even though as human beings we have this innate ability to think about the future. It's quite hard actually to get people to think beyond today. We're quite good at remembering our memories and thinking about what happened over the last year or so, but thinking beyond the present is quite a hard task. So what we need to do is immerse people in today in the future. So this is an example from a project that we did looking at the future of land use in the UK. And we needed to bring to life what the demand and supply would be for a range of different goods. And you might be quite startled by some of the prices here, but it was able to help paint a picture of what the future might look like in 10 years' time for people. So they could really immerse themselves and think through what those challenges would be. If we move to the rule number 7, there are pockets of the future already existing today. It's really important when we're doing foresight work to look back and understand how trends are changing over time and what that could mean for the future. But it's equally, if not more important, to look out beyond our peripheral vision, to look to other spaces, other sectors, other markets, other geographies, and understand what we call weak signals of the future. There will be people thinking about these challenges already. And these people tend to be very good problem solvers. They see an issue that's only going to be exacerbated in the future, and they're able to come up with an example. So this is an art gallery in Australia, and it was built on these huge stilts across a valley. And the reason they did that is because it will inevitably have floods. This is a given, and they're only going to be exacerbated over many years to come. So they built the art gallery on stilts, and they were also planned to harness the water to recycle it for future use. So they looked at a future state and they said, how can we plan today to harness, actually, for our benefit, the threats of the future? So that is an example of a pocket of the future existing today. And our final rule of Foresight Club is that we must remember that we are all part of the future. And actually, people like you in this room have the power to actually change what the future might look like. We can put into place policies, plans, organisational strategies to try and move ourselves to a future that we wish to see. It's not predestined, and it's up to us to actually use that power that we have as human beings to make that change. So if we move to the next slide, I have taken you through quite a lot of ideas in this presentation, and I just wanted to close this off with 5 final thoughts. So the first one, we must consider the total change landscape when we're thinking about the future. Don't just focus on the macro level issues. Remember to think about the human level attitudes and values, and make sure we look out for those signals of change that we can borrow, beg and steal from other places and spaces to aid our future planning. The second rule is that we should really embrace our innate human power to do this and use that to help grow the economy. The third point, we must embrace that ESG exists in this world of multitude of different drives of change, this macro environment, and we must plan with all of that in mind. The fourth point, we need to balance the needs of today with the balancing the needs of tomorrow. And this is really important because I think, and we frankly saw this quite a lot in the COVID pandemic, the clients that we were working with were very focused on today's challenge, and of course that was a huge challenge. but it meant that they took their foot off the pedal in terms of thinking about what's next, and then they were on the back foot in terms of planning for that future state. And finally, the final point I wanted to make is that we need to leave our preconceptions behind and all become paid-up members of the Foresight Club. So that's it for me today. Here's my email. If anybody wants to ask me questions after the session, please do drop me a line. I hope that that's been interesting and insightful, and enjoy the rest of the conference.